us begin, or perhaps let us continue where we left off last week. Aaron predetermined my title for me today. So, we are continuing through in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, specifically the last three of the six so-called antitheses, where Jesus is in the sermon giving commentary on, or rather, giving the appropriate and accurate interpretations of Old Testament law. So he is contradicting what the Jewish rabbis have been teaching and giving instructions for how his followers, we, his disciples, ought to conduct ourselves towards one another. So I will read the whole passage and then we will get into it. This is Matthew, I should have written this up there. Matthew 5, verse 33 through the end of the chapter. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn." But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Let's pray. Lord God, give us clarity as we study your word. Help me to communicate clearly and effectively. May my heart and the hearts of all here be soft to your instruction. Let us be convicted and let us see you and your righteousness more clearly. Bless us as we study your word. Through Jesus Christ. Amen. So the structure that Aaron outlined last week for these antitheses, I think, is still helpful and appropriate for the three today. So Aaron argued that each one begins with a quotation, proceeds to, so where Jesus is quoting either directly or a summary of statements from the Old Testament. Then he lays bare what the Jewish rabbis have been doing with this particular text, showing how it is actually a perversion of what the text intended. And then he gives instruction to his people. See last week's disclaimers on handwriting and spelling. There we are. So this doesn't fit perfectly with all the antitheses this week. Sometimes the laying bare is included in the instruction or vice versa, but I think it's still helpful for us. We will use it still. Okay, so first, kingdom perspective on honesty or on truthful speech. This is verse 33 of Matthew 5. He quotes, he says, you have heard it was said to those of old, right? Those of old being the Israelites in either under the Mosaic law or under the kings and the prophets. You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. This is interesting. It's not a direct quotation of any particular Old Testament passage. It's a decent summary of a number of them, such as Exodus 20, verse 7, part of the Ten Commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Or Numbers chapter 30, verse 2. If a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. So not a direct quotation, but a good summary. The principle in the Old Testament is clear that you should be honest with your speech. What you say, you should do. Now, something we should make a slight distinction about. Jesus uses the term oaths, but then there's also in the Old Testament the concept of vows. In general, I think it's safe to say oaths pertain to our relations with one another. Vows pertain to our relationship with God. So we make a vow, or in the Old Testament they would make a vow before God to say, I will do X, Y, Z for God. An example of this might be the Nazirite vow, where the individual would set himself aside for a particular period of time, abstain from alcohol, abstain from cutting his hair and touching any sort of dead things, maintaining a higher level of cleanliness than was ordinary for a period of time to show devotion, at the end of which he would cut off his hair, present it as a sacrifice to God, basically showing, here, I have done what I have said I would do. Oaths are different. Oaths are, you could consider this like an oath of office, right? Someone coming into a position, promising something to a particular group of people. Or a contract. You know, if I am selling something to Jameson, I promise that it's in good condition and he promises to pay. Some sort of contract between two individuals. Perhaps we don't really have a good concept of vow. I would argue perhaps that the marriage vow is our equivalent of what the Old Testament would have considered a vow. We are vowing not only to the one we are marrying, but also in the sight of God. We are vowing to God to keep our vows. But what we are concerned with here is oaths. What is our responsibility in our speech to one another? Now, the principle in, let's take Exodus 27, is clear. It says, do not take the name of the Lord in vain. Right? The rabbis, they make a subtle change. And we see this in a number of the antitheses, a subtle change from the emphasis being on, rather than, so if the command is, do not take the name of the Lord in vain. The understanding here is, right, do what you say, right? They switch the emphasis from in vain to the name of the Lord. The emphasis in the rabbinic teaching then was the important thing is not to take the name of the Lord in vain. It's a subtle switch from this being an issue of perjury, right? Don't lie, do what you say, to profanity. So, rather than this being an issue of be honest with your fellow men, the Jewish rabbis made this an issue of don't take the name of the Lord. Be very careful with the name of the Lord. It's no longer about how you deal with your fellow man. It's now about an external righteousness, being very careful with your speech. And they came up with elaborate rules to avoid profanity, right? So you would not misspeak, so you wouldn't accidentally or on purpose break a vow that was made in the name of the Lord. We'll get into that a little bit more later. But regardless, it's no longer concerned with actual honesty. It's now concerned with an external holiness. And it became a means for clever men to exploit others with creative loopholes. So perhaps the best example I could think of in the modern experience is from the comic strip Peanuts, which I very much enjoyed growing up. There is a continual motif in the comic strip where one of the characters, Charlie Brown, wishes to kick a football. And another one of the characters promises to hold the football for him so that he can run up and kick it. But invariably, Lucy, the other character, pulls the football away at the last second, and he goes flying comically into the air with a great og and then falls with a great whumph. And so the motif in the comic strip is that she comes up with more and more ways to convince him that she will not pull the football away. I've brought one. It's too small for you all to see, so I will read it for you. Lucy stands before Charlie Brown. She says, "I'll hold the ball and you kick it." Charlie Brown will have none of it. He says, "Oh, brother, I don't mind your dishonesty half as much as I mind your opinion of me. You must think I'm really stupid." Lucy says, "I know you don't trust me, Charlie Brown. You think that I'm going to pull this football away when you come running up to kick it. Well, here's a signed document testifying that I promise not to." Charlie Brown takes the document and walks away. He says, "It is signed. It's a signed document." So then, clutching the document, with a determined expression on his face, he sprints towards Lucy. He says, "I guess if you have a signed document in your possession, you can't go wrong. This year, I'm really going to kick that football." To no one's surprise, Lucy pulls the football away. Charlie Brown flies into the air with an anguished og and falls with a great whumph. The document floats gently to the ground. Lucy grabs it, and the last panel is Lucy saying, "Peculiar thing about this document, it was never notarized." So this is the idea here. It's maintaining technical righteousness, right? It's maintaining technical legality while intending to deceive. Maybe a more trivial example is children on the playground, right? Promising to do something, but then, I crossed my fingers, so it doesn't count, right? Or maybe obscure fine print or addendums in contracts, where you have an addendum to the contract that totally overrules the contract, but nobody reads it, and so you're intending to deceive, but technically your hands are clean. So this is the situation. Jesus then lays it bare. He says, "But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And don't take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black." Here he outright contradicts. He says, don't make oaths at all. And then he exposes the rabbinic teaching as inescapably problematic. So if the point here was not to take the name of the Lord in vain, well, then the question was, what things can you swear by that are close enough to the name of the Lord or not close enough to the name of the Lord, right? So if I swear by the name of the Lord, obviously, then that's binding. What if I swear by something else that's closely related to the name of the Lord, but not quite? They started drawing these fine lines and distinctions. My favorite example, perhaps, is Jerusalem. If you were to swear by Jerusalem, well, that's not binding, because that's far enough away from the name of God. But if you swear towards Jerusalem, well, then that is, you're clearly facing where God lives, and so that is binding, right? So these distinctions became increasingly really absurd, and they really went on and on. Maybe a good example, Jesus comments on this later, if you want to look in Matthew 23, verse 16. This is in the middle of him pronouncing woes on the scribes and the Pharisees. Verse 16, Matthew 23, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound by his oath. You blind fools, For which is greater, the gold or the temple that is made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, then he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by it, whoever swears by the altar, swears by it and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple, swears by it and by him who dwells on it. And whoever swears by heaven, swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. So he then goes, if we return back to Matthew 5, he then takes us through a few examples that might have been, particular cases for the rabbis. He says, if you swear by heaven, well, that's where God lives, right? Then you're still closely associated with God himself. If you swear by earth, God made it. It's his footstool. You're not getting away from God by swearing by the earth as opposed to heaven. And if you swear by Jerusalem, well, that's his city. The city of the great king seems to be a reference to God himself. That is God's city. It's where his presence was. So if you swear by heaven, you're swearing by God. If you swear by earth, you're swearing by God. If you swear by Jerusalem, you're swearing by God. He even takes it to the example of, what if you swear by your own head? Okay. The equivalent there would be basically, if I don't do what I've said, may I lose my head, right? May I be decapitated. Jesus says, you cannot make one hair of your head white or black. Probably a reference to the aging process. Right? So you can't stop yourself from growing old. You can't save your own life. You don't have control over your own life. So you swearing by your own head, or even the hairs of your head, that's still not under your jurisdiction. You can't get away from swearing by God. It's all his. So these absurd games that they were playing were pointless. There's no escaping God's authority and jurisdiction. So his instruction then is simple. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Be simple and straightforward and honest and truthful in your speech. Do not settle for technical honesty. It's possible and easy, in fact, if you're clever, to speak nothing but truths and yet deceive, right? To strategically misrepresent the truth, to say exactly, technically what is right, but intend in your heart to deceive. And the disciples of Jesus are to be characterized by not just external truthfulness, but deep and abiding truthfulness. I think a lovely example of this is in Psalm 15. You can turn there if you like. I'm going to read it regardless. It says, O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? He who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks the truth, interestingly, speaks the truth in his heart, right? The heart is not the organ of speech, right? But the psalmist is showing that we speak forth from our hearts. So speak the truth, not just with your lips intending to deceive, but from your heart. Who does not slander with his tongue, does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach among his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fears the Lord, who swears to his own hurt and does not change, who does not put out his money at interest and does not take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved. Here David is describing the righteous man, right? Ultimately describing Christ. But it's interesting the ways in which he describes the righteous man, who speaks the truth from his heart, does not slander with his lips, who, when he has committed himself, right, is willing to be wrong, is willing to fulfill what he has said, even if it hurts him. And this is largely why we seek to deceive with our mouths, right? We were trying to hold back something for ourselves. Why do you put fine print in a contract? that you don't intend to be read. Well, so you don't have to do whatever you're saying. It's so that you can maintain your own time or property or belongings or capital, right? So the idea of swearing to your own hurt, I think, gets at this idea. Now, Jesus' instructions here are essentially to make oath-taking unnecessary. Why does Lucy bring a signed document to Charlie Brown? Because she knows she won't be trusted otherwise. Why do we swear oaths? It's because men are wicked liars. At least on average, we have the capability to say something and not do it. So what Jesus is saying is, be so honest and straightforward in your speech. You have no need to commit yourself to some higher oath, right? That your normal speech is the same level as another man's oath, right? Is perhaps the idea. If we are characterized by unfailing straight speech and integrity of heart and word, then oath-taking would be unnecessary. Now, he finishes there by saying anything more than this is from evil. From evil probably refers to Satan, right? That anything more than saying a simple yes or a simple no is from Satan, Satan being the father of lies. So if our speech is more than simple honesty, then we're intending to deceive in some manner, then we are showing ourselves to be from the father of lies, from Satan. Our speech shows who we are and who we are from, either from God, in whom there is no change or no falsehood, or from Satan, the father of lies. Now, a few sort of concerns or final statements in this antithesis. Does this mean we should never take oaths, right? Never take an oath of office, or not even take wedding vows? This is an approach taken by Anabaptists several hundred years ago, and also Quakers. I think are there still Quakers? There are still Quakers. They still take this approach and refuse to take any oaths even in a courtroom. This seems to be a simplistic application of Christ's teaching. It seems to be that both Jesus and Paul at various times are put under oath and don't object. So I don't think that that's exactly a faithful application here. Another question, though, that might come to your minds is, if oaths exist because of the potential deceit of the person making the oath, why does God swear an oath? Why does Jesus say, truly I say to you? Why does Paul in Galatians say, before God I am not lying? These all seem to be doing the same sort of thing. It seems to be in general that oaths exist also to assure those who might be tempted to doubt. So God commits himself by an oath, not because he can change or lie, but because we might doubt. Same for Jesus and for Paul. What is the application for us? Love the truth in our hearts, to be committed to right speech, simple, honest speech from our hearts, and to not believe that external truthfulness that conceals a desire to deceive is somehow okay, or if we can just keep our hands clean and not say anything technically wrong, that we are just. I think also an application of this is to avoid exaggeration, to avoid embellishment, out of a desire to be well thought of. It's easy to tell a story and spin a few of the details in a light that, well, maybe not technically false, certainly conceals and makes things look different than what they were, right? You're telling a story in order to get those hearing the story to see you in a certain light. And I think that's also falls under this antithesis. Speak truly. Perhaps more than that, though, above that, trust in God to meet your needs. Don't think that you need to grasp or to hold on to or to gouge out every possible advantage for yourself. Okay. Questions, thoughts on this particular antithesis? All right. Let's go on. Jesus says in verse 38, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." So this is kingdom perspective on retaliation. How are we to respond when wronged? There we are. So he quotes an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is a direct quotation from several Old Testament passages, is part of the lex talionis, or the law governing retaliation, how you are to respond when you are wronged. So what's the idea here? The law says if someone knocks out your tooth, that then justice would be for their tooth to be knocked out. If they gouge out your eye, justice would be for their eye to be gouged out. This is not meant to, really this is meant to two things. One, to avoid leniency, right, let justice be done, but perhaps more to avoid excess. Tell you what, if somebody knocks out your tooth, you're not thinking like, okay, well that was the lower right canine incisor, so that should be their lower right canine incisor. No, you're thinking, I'm going to put you down and not let you hurt me ever again, right? And then I'm going to burn your house, because that was really unpleasant. I can't grow another tooth, right? In the Old Testament. Still can't, but anyways. So it's meant to both make sure justice is done, but also to avoid excess, right? Let justice be according to the wrong that was done. This is not necessarily taken literally, even in the Old Testament. There's another portion of the law where the Israelites were instructed that if a master is beating a slave and he knocks out his tooth or damages his eye, then he is to let him go. The implication being not that the master would lose his tooth or his eye or have exactly done to him what he did to the slave, but that he would forfeit his profit, right? So usually slavery was sort of an indentured servanthood. Someone is paying back a debt. So Jesus, or the Old Testament laws, is saying that if this damage is done, a material compensation is sufficient. So this was probably what was more commonly done in this time period. Regardless, this is a civil principle. It's a court of law. It's not about personal interactions. So in Jesus, there's no particular section here where Jesus lays bare this teaching, but it's implicit. It's reasonable to assume that he is, in this time period, this principle that is right in the civil court is being taken to personal interactions, right? So you hit my car, so your insurance should pay for it, right? That's well and good. But you hit my car, so where's my hammer? I'm going to do dent for dent on your car, right? That's personal retaliation, which is not under the governance of the civil magistrate. So Jesus' instructions are, I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. And this is difficult for us to think about, so let's be a little bit careful. Do not resist the evil one. Some translations say do not resist evil. Probably not the best translation. This is probably a good one. Don't resist the one who is evil, or the one who is harming you. Be willing to be personally wronged, and do not hold on to your own belongings or dignity. It's not an instruction to be complicit with or compromise with evil, right? Where if you see gangs marauding in the streets, you say, well, don't resist the evil one. On your way, right? Be warm and well fed. No, it rather is a reference to the disciples' personal interaction with those individuals who have wronged or oppose them. It's not a reason to be slack in doing justice. It's, again, an instruction to the heart of the disciple, that our hearts should bear no animosity towards those who harm us. And he gives 4 illustrations. These are vivid little pictures, cameos, so to speak, that illustrate this principle. And I think what he includes and what he does not include is telling. So first, the slap. It says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. So I think that, the wording is important. So I'm not going to have you actually do this, Michael, but let's say Michael was here, standing in front of me. Michael, which one's your right cheek? That one there. Okay. So let's assume, correctly, that I am right-handed, as most of Jesus' listeners probably were. So if I'm right-handed, I'm going to do my slapping with my right hand. If I'm going to slap Michael's right cheek, right, I can do this number here, right? But that's not going to be particularly effective. What is referenced here? It's the backhand. Right? That's the only effective way for me to strike Michael's right cheek with my right hand. So this is the backhanded strike. It's the insult. So Jesus could have used any example here, right? He just referenced eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. He could have said, if someone gouges out your left eye, let them gouge out your right eye too. Or if someone knocks out your one tooth, let them knock out your other tooth as well. He doesn't use those. He uses it's a physical strike, but it's the insulting strike. The idea here is that this is a blow not intended to harm, but intended to harm the dignity. Jesus instructs his disciples to be willing to suffer further insult and abuse. We are to reject this idea. If I let him get away with this, right, he's insulted me. If I let him get away with it, he might do it again. I need to protect my interests. But rather, he might insult me again, right? And if so, so be it. I must be pure of heart. This is not, I think, a prohibition of self-defense. Again, he could have used any example. Also, interestingly enough, he says, turn the other also, right? So which is more painful, the backhanded slap with the knuckles or the forehand slap? Probably the backhand. So the first strike is the greater, the latter is the lesser. So I think it is significant that Jesus is referring to a decrease in the severity of the assault. It's not like if someone breaks your nose, let them also break your femur, right? This is not what he's saying. He's not saying to be a doormat, but to endure suffering without personal retaliation or revenge. Jesus, in particular circumstances, defended himself. He withdrew, right, rather than allow them to stone him. Also, he protested the injustice of his own beatings at several times, at one point at least, but Paul does as well. So I don't think the idea here is for us to just lie down and take whatever comes, but to be free of animosity in our hearts and to be willing to be wronged, particularly in our dignity. Also, I think another caveat, don't neglect your duties as a member of society. So if you think that you have to let the criminal get away, well, you are suffering wrong yourself, yes, but you're also, in a sense, inflicting wrong on others. So you have duties to society, not to let evil run rampant. This instruction is primarily about our hearts. It prohibits not justice, right, but personal animosity. So that's the slap. Then there's the lawsuit. So if someone sues you, and I think the context here would indicate that this is a legitimate lawsuit, right? Either you've done something wrong or there was neglect on your part. This is a legitimate suit. And Jesus is saying that his specific instructions regard the tunic and the cloak. Important for us to understand this. When he says the tunic, this would have been a close-fitting garment worn next to the body, extending all the way down to your ankles, made of linen or of wool. Very valuable, as all suits of clothing were when before the Industrial Revolution. But this is often, because of its value, often used as payment or collateral. So, I will put my clothes in pledge, right? If you can take the shirt off my back, if I don't do what I say, or if I don't return to you your oxen when I borrowed it, or whatever. So the tunic, close-fitting next to the body. The cloak is the outer robe, right, or wrap, often used by the poor as a blanket in the cold. Also very valuable. The cloak was protected by Old Testament law. It wasn't allowed to be taken as pledge overnight. So you could take it as pledge during the day, but you had to give it back to him during the night, right? So what Jesus is saying here is to go above and beyond what necessarily strict justice requires. So maybe the idea here is, let's say Jameson, first century Jew, and he's sued by Michael. Sorry, they're the ones right here, and so I keep using them as examples. Michael sues Jameson, and Jameson has to give up his tunic. Now, the tunic is a nice tunic, Jameson, but it's really not what you owe by justice to Michael. But Michael can't, by law, take your cloak. So Jameson has two options, right? He can say, ha ha ha, give him his tunic, and go off and wear his second tunic, right? Or Jesus is instructing here, no, actually give up what the law says you ought not to give up. Give him your cloak, which is worth more than your tunic, maybe worth more than what you owe him. But be willing to be wronged for the sake of purity of heart, for the sake of justice. I don't think we have time to look at Romans 12. We'll look at it later. Third, the conscription. This is probably least familiar to us. The Jews in this time lived under Roman oppression, where there were soldiers living amongst them in their day-to-day lives. And the soldiers, as soldiers do, move things here and there. And so it was a common, if not a lawful practice, it was a common practice that a Roman soldier could, let's say, requisition your animal to take his stuff from point A to point B. If you didn't have an animal, he could requisition your person. You carry my things from point A to point B. Not necessarily lawful practice, often abused, but a common practice, to the point where in Rome, the emperor's personal animals had special tags to show that they couldn't be taken, right? So clearly a common practice. And we see it at least in one case of Simon of Cyrene, who was asked to carry Jesus' cross, right? Presumably he's a bystander, right? But the soldiers see that Jesus can't carry his own cross, so they say, you, come, carry it, you have to. That's the law. And Jesus' term here for mile is the Latin term, meaning 1,000 paces. His use of the Latin is probably a further justification or further evidence that he's referring to this practice of the Romans, right, who would have spoken Latin, oppressing the Jews and causing them to do manual labor for them. This is, again, a refusal to hold on to your own dignity, a willingness to be wronged. And this would have been crazy and absurd to Jesus' hearers. In AD 6, this is probably AD 29, 30, 31. In AD 6, there was a man named Judas the Galilean who led a violent uprising that was eventually put down, and probably the result of the more severe occupation of Palestine. His followers and descendants continued in this, in the last 20, 30 years between then and now, continued sort of urban terrorism, right? And you can imagine being a first century Jew. You're not going to participate yourself, but they got another one, right? Man, that one particularly odious Roman centurion, they got him, right? He deserved it. The actions of Judas the Galilean's followers eventually lead to the revolt that leads to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So Palestine is at best a rather volatile, unstable political situation. Jesus is periodically, right, the followers of his hearers want to make him king, right? Let's throw off the Roman shackles. But nevertheless, Jesus says, cooperate with the oppressive tyrants. Go above and beyond. And again, this is personal, right? If a Roman soldier were to come up to you and say, carry my things for 1 mile, on the one hand, he is, a finger of imperial Rome, but he's also a man who's going to have to carry his stuff anyways. So Jesus is saying, out of compassion and humility, be willing to carry this man's stuff another mile. Go above and beyond what the law requires of you or what the oppressive regime requires of you. And reject utterly personal animosity, right? Because what might you do? You're like, yeah, I'll carry your stuff. This is my fastest walking pace. Also, I require potty breaks every 12 yards, right? Right, to obstruct what they're trying to do. Jesus says, don't do that. Go above and beyond. We don't live under an oppressive regime, at least not in the same way, but still we are called to reject personal animosity or retaliation. I think the best example I can think of for this is perhaps we are called to willingly participate in bureaucratic frustrations, right? Taxes or, I don't know, all the various ways that the paperwork doth pile up when we are dealing with the federal government. Or perhaps going above and beyond in our kindness to clerks or officials, even the ones who are purposefully making it more difficult for us. I don't like it, but it seems to be a just application of Jesus' words. The last example is the enemy in need. The enemy in need. How are we to react? So his words there are, do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Give to the one who begs from you. I don't think, neither in the Old Testament nor the New Testament, are we instructed to subsidize sloth or irresponsibility. Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, something to the effect of, if they don't work, they don't eat, right? So this is not frivolous laziness that Jesus is saying here. This is a legitimate need. Someone has come upon hard times, right? They need a loan, right? Or they need gas money to get to a job interview or something like this. This is, I think, the best interpretation of this in connection here is, what if it's your enemy? What if it's someone you don't like who has a legitimate need and comes to you for a loan or for a ride or for something like that? What is your temptation? Like, well, not my business. Sorry, this has happened to you. Really am. Can't help you, right? Kick them while they're down, sort of thing. Passive aggressive. I'm not going to hurt you, but I'm not going to help you either. Seems to me what Jesus is saying is that even when we have done nothing wrong, we are to again go above and beyond in our care for enemies. Don't refuse to help him just because of what he has done and to get even on him or with him. Okay, let me go on because we are running out of time. Thoughts, questions on retaliation or the lack thereof? Well, then last, and really the logical continuation of this antithesis. This is a kingdom perspective on love and hate. Jesus quotes, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. This is a blatant addition to and perversion of the Old Testament text. Nowhere does it ever say to hate your enemy. Far from it. It actually gives specific instructions on if you find your enemy's ox or donkey running astray, take it back to him, right? The same instruction is given to your brother. So this is a perversion of what the text meant. The Jews probably, but also striking here is not just the addition of and hate your enemy, but the removal. Love your neighbor, and what's the second part there? As yourself. Right? So the removal of as yourself is also telling. It's changing from being a command of how you are to love and changing it to who you are to love. Right? So, okay, you can see the wily minds going like, okay, right, I know love, etc., right? But let me just figure out who I'm supposed to love, and then I'll work on loving them. But in that confusion, in that little bean and shell game, right, you've removed from the as yourself part. So, again, the Jews probably applied this nationally, right? Love my fellow Jews, the ones who I'm like, the ones I share beliefs with, and hate the Gentile oppressors, or the Gentile scum, or the Samaritans, or etc. Jesus doesn't specifically lay bare this quotation or this practice. It's fairly obvious. The intention of the law is clearly both to friend and foe alike. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, you may remember, it begins with a lawyer asking him, who is my neighbor? Right? And Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. But you see the lawyer asking again that, not the how, but who? Who am I to love, Jesus? Right? And Jesus flips it on his head. He says, anyone you are in a position to aid is your neighbor. And he asks, who would you want to consider you a neighbor? Right? Changing it back to do as you would have done. Right? Love your neighbor as yourself. So, we are to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. I would argue this is the logical conclusion of the previous antithesis, right? In fact, the don't retaliate almost falls a little flat. Like, okay, so am I just supposed to not just be willing to be wronged, right? How is that salt and light? Sure, it might work, right? Maybe the Roman soldier, as I'm carrying his stuff a second mile, maybe he'll go, wow, that's really remarkable. Tell me more about that. But maybe he's like, sweet, all right, well, you go 3, right? And take further advantage of you. So the non-retaliation, well and good, but it seems to be that this is the triumphant final note. Not just to not retaliate, but seek the good of your enemies. Ancient church father and writer John Chrysostom, in commentary on this particular text, traces 9 ascending steps in our relationship and responsibility to our enemies. And I think that this is helpful to us. His first step is don't take initiative ourselves. Second, don't avenge another's evil, right? Turn to the other cheek. 3, be quiet and peaceable. 4, suffer wrongfully. 5, surrender to the evildoer more than he demands, right? Both the lawsuit and the conscription. Do not hate the evildoer. 6, love him. Do him good, right? Love him in your heart, right? Like, man, I really love him in my heart, but he's thousands of miles away, so I can't really act upon that. But not only love him in your heart, but do him good. And the final step, Chrysostom argues, and I agree, is to pray for him. He called this the very highest summit of self-control. Prayer is hard enough as it is, but praying for our enemies, praying for those who actively seek our harm. Unless we want to draw lines and distinctions, who is our enemy, right? Who are we to pray for? Probably included here is not just national enemies or even individual enemies. Those are included. But this extends to the one who persecutes the Christian disciple as an expression of his hatred for God. Those are the ones that we are to love. Those are the ones that we are to pray for. Even those. And why? Why should we do so? Well, in doing so, we are loving as God does. Jesus' examples here say, for he, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and the just. He makes the rain fall on the evil and the good. He sends his rain on the just and on the unjust. Both sun and rain, right? That's the principal elements for economy and well-being. If you don't have sunshine and rain, you don't have crops. You don't have crops, you don't have food, you die, right? So Jesus is saying that God sends blessings, showers down blessings on those who hate him. And if we do the same, we are like him. We are showing ourselves to be sons of God. Also, praying for our enemies increases our love for them. It's very, very difficult, though not impossible, to pray for someone and not love them more. Right? And if you're praying for them in that way, you're probably not praying for them right, so don't do that. So, just as sons grow up to look like the Father, as we love those who hate us, if we return good for evil, we are resembling our Father. We are acting as salt and light. Briefly now, because we're out of time, Jesus says, if you only do good to those who do good to you, you're no different from anyone else. Right? You are not being preserving and illuminating agents as he has told us that we are. So our love should exceed that of those around us. Now, one perhaps last question or concern is, what about the imprecatory psalms? What about hating what God hates? I think a helpful illustration here is, rather than saying in your prayers, Lord, may Harry be struck down in your righteous anger and his house turned into a pile of rubble and his orphan children starve in the streets. Right? Which is almost a direct quotation of Psalm 109, except for the Harry part. Rather, we are to say, Lord, let your justice be done here on earth. May all those who reject you burn in the lake of fire. And may Harry not be among them. May he repent of his evil and come to Christ. And may you receive him with mercy. It's a tall order. I think that in wrapping up, the prevailing principle here is trust in God. How can we do any of this? How can we not retaliate when evil is done to us? And how can we love those who hate us? I think that can only be done if we have faith in the providence of God, faith in his provision for us here and now, and hope in eschatological judgment, that in the end, right will be rewarded and wrong will be punished. And so we are to know and hold fast to the fact that his kingdom comes, and that we are citizens of that kingdom. So, I've kept you long. Forgive me. Any questions? No? Good. All right. You're dismissed.